The race was over before Montgomery knew it had begun. That was the problem. Bernard Law Montgomery, Britain's most decorated general, had spent months building toward a single moment, a grand, organised, perfectly staged crossing of the Rhine that would define the Allied endgame and cement his name in history. He had the resources, he had Churchill's blessing, he had the spotlight already aimed at him. And then, quietly, without ceremony, without permission, and without waiting for the largest airborne operation in the history of the war to begin, George S. Patton crossed the Rhine first. No fanfare, no press release, just a phone call the next morning that left the Allied High Command briefly speechless. The question was never whether Patton could cross. The question was why he needed to do it that way, and what it cost him. By March of 1945, the war in Europe had taken on a different shape. Germany was not yet finished, but it was fracturing. The Wehrmacht was retreating on multiple fronts, supply lines were collapsing, and the question consuming Allied command was no longer whether Germany would fall. It was who would be standing where when it did. That question mattered more than most people in 1945 were willing to say publicly, because the answer had consequences that stretched far beyond VE Day. Eisenhower commanded the Western Allied forces, but commanding Eisenhower's generals was a different problem entirely. On one side was Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, meticulous, deliberate, and deeply convinced that the correct way to end the war in the West was through a single, concentrated thrust into northern Germany under unified command, his command. Montgomery had argued this case repeatedly. He had argued it to Eisenhower. He had argued it to Churchill. He had argued it in memoranda that left little doubt about who he believed should lead the decisive blow. On the other side was George Patton, commanding the Third Army, who had spent the winter grinding through the Ardennes, recovering from the chaos of the Bulge, and pushing forward with the relentless aggression that defined everything he did. Patton did not argue for a broad front or a narrow front. Patton argued for movement, speed, action before the enemy could breathe. To Patton, hesitation was not caution, it was defeat in slow motion. These two philosophies were always in tension. But by the time the Rhine appeared on both men's horizons, that tension was no longer just strategic. It had become personal. Operation Plunder was Montgomery's masterpiece in planning. It was scheduled for the night of March 23rd, 1945. The largest airborne and amphibious crossing of the Rhine in the entire war. Months of coordination. Thousands of paratroopers. A full artillery preparation involving over 3,000 guns. It was designed to be definitive, a crossing so overwhelming, so documented, so visually powerful that history would have no choice but to record it as the moment the Western Allies broke Germany's final natural barrier. Montgomery had secured priority allocation of resources for it. He had secured the involvement of the American VE Airborne Corps, alongside British forces. And he had the attention of the press, the High Command, and the British public, who needed a victory that felt like their own after years of grinding sacrifice. Patton understood all of this. He understood the politics of it. He understood that Montgomery's crossing was meant to be the defining image of the Western Allied campaign in its final chapter. He understood that whoever crossed the Rhine first, under those cameras, with that scale, would carry a kind of ownership over the endgame that no subsequent achievement could entirely erase. And that understanding drove him in a direction that was entirely characteristic, not toward protest, not toward memoranda, not toward the corridors of Allied command where men in pressed uniforms debated priority assignments. It drove him toward the river. Quietly. Fast. Before the world was watching. The problem was not that Patton disagreed with the plan. The problem was that Patton did not intend to wait for it. The crossing at Oppenheim did not begin with a grand announcement. That was the point. On the night of March 22, 1945, one day before Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin, elements of the Third Army's 5th Infantry Division began crossing the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim, south of Mainz. The crossing used assault boats. There was minimal artillery preparation by Patton's usual standards. The idea was not to make noise. The idea was to get to the other side before anyone could say no. By the early morning hours of March 23rd, American soldiers were across. The Rhine had been crossed. Not by the force of Operation Plunder, not under Montgomery's carefully constructed plan, not with 3,000 guns announcing the moment to history, but by the Third Army, quietly, in the dark, with the methodical efficiency of men who had been told to move and move. The historical record gives us the outcome, not every sentence spoken in those hours. But what the record does preserve is Patton's phone call to Omar Bradley on the morning of March 23rd. By accounts widely reported in post-war memoirs and histories, Patton's communication to his superior was direct. He wanted Bradley to know the Third Army was across before the press learned of it, and before Montgomery's crossing had begun. The tone, by multiple accounts, carried a satisfaction that Patton made no effort to disguise. That was when the story stopped being purely about a river crossing. Because what followed was not simply a tactical development. It was a collision between two visions of who this war belonged to, and who had the right to write its final chapter. Montgomery's operation proceeded as planned on the night of March 23rd, supported by massive airborne assault, covered by a media apparatus, prepared to document the event in exhaustive detail. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary military operation. But the Rhine was no longer uncrossed when the cameras were ready, and Patton had made sure of that. The deeper layer of this story is not about a river. It is about the architecture of Allied politics in the final phase of the war, and what it meant for a theatre commander to make a unilateral decision that effectively undermined the symbolic weight of a carefully staged operation, supported by the highest levels of British and American command. Eisenhower knew what had happened. Bradley knew. The British command knew. And the reaction was a study in controlled frustration, because there was very little anyone could formally object to. Patton had crossed the Rhine, with minimal casualties, without a crisis. He had done exactly what he was supposed to do as a combat commander. He had just done it 24 hours early, and without telling anyone until it was done. The silence from higher command was the silence of men who understood that they had just been outmaneuvered, not militarily but politically, and that the general responsible was entirely aware of what he had done. What made this moment a confrontation rather than simply an achievement was what Patton did next. He did not allow the crossing to pass without emphasis. He did not quietly continue his advance and let the historical record sort itself out. On March 24th, the day after plunder began, Patton crossed the Rhine himself, standing upright deliberately, making a show of the moment that his staff and the men around him understood immediately. Accounts of the crossing note that he stopped mid-bridge, and by some reports, the gesture he made over the river was unmistakably theatrical, the kind of calculated performance he had been delivering since North Africa. It was not an accident. Patton's sense of theatre was never accidental. Every public gesture was designed to communicate something, not just to the men watching, but to the record that would follow. Crossing the Rhine standing upright, in full view, on the day after Montgomery's massive operation had begun, was not a coincidence of timing, it was a statement. The tension with Montgomery was real, even if the exact exchange between them was never formally recorded in terms that history has fully preserved. What the historical record does preserve is the broader context. Montgomery's frustration with the broad front strategy, his repeated arguments for concentrated command, his conviction that Eisenhower's approach was diffuse and dangerous, and his stated belief that a single thrust under unified Allied command, his command, offered the fastest path to victory. Against that backdrop, Patton's crossing at Oppenheim was not simply a tactical initiative. It was a direct answer to a question Montgomery had been asking for months. The answer was, the Americans did not need to wait for the British to lead. That was a dangerous answer, politically. The alliance was the instrument of victory, and the alliance required the participation of men whose national pride and personal ambition were enormous, whose governments were watching, and whose publics needed to believe that their sacrifices had shaped the outcome. Montgomery's operation was partly military and partly political. It was designed to ensure that Britain's role in the final Allied drive into Germany was visible, commanding, and historically permanent. Patton had not destroyed that operation. He had simply arrived first. And in a war where a rival order carried enormous symbolic weight, that was enough to reshape the story. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim did not change the course of the war in any material sense. Germany was already losing when Patton crossed. The momentum was irreversible. What the crossing changed was the narrative, and in the world of 1945, narrative mattered in ways that would echo for decades. Montgomery's reputation as a careful, deliberate commander who prioritised security over speed had made him both celebrated and criticised throughout the war. His victories in North Africa and Normandy were genuine. His operational caution had frustrated American commanders repeatedly, most visibly during the Normandy breakout and later during the Arnhem disaster, where the bold ambition of Market Garden had collided with the operational risks that careful commanders sometimes underestimate when they move fast. By the Rhine, Montgomery's caution had become associated in the minds of many American officers with something else, with a preference for control that sometimes looked indistinguishable from a preference for credit. Patton's crossing stripped the moment of that control without attacking it directly. He did not issue a public statement challenging Montgomery's plan. He did not write a memorandum arguing against Operation Plunder. He simply moved, as he had always moved, and let the facts answer the argument. The consequence was a subtle but real shift in how Allied command understood the relationship between its American and British components in the war's final weeks. Eisenhower's broad front strategy continued. Montgomery's forces drove north toward Hamburg and the Baltic. Patton's Third Army drove east with the speed that had defined it since the breakout from Normandy. But the question of who had reached the Rhine first, and under what circumstances, became part of the historical argument about Allied leadership that has continued in military literature ever since. The story of Patton and the Rhine is not, in the end, a story about a river. It is a story about what happens when the politics of victory begin to consume as much energy as the pursuit of it. By 1945, the Western Alliance had beaten back the worst military catastrophe in modern European history. The men who did it were extraordinary, but they were also human, with ambitions, with rivalries, with national pressures that did not disappear because the cause was just. Montgomery was not wrong to want Britain's contribution recognised. The British had been fighting longer than the Americans had been in Europe. They had paid in blood through North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. The desire for a moment of conclusive, visible leadership was not vanity without context. Patton was not wrong to move when movement was possible. His belief that speed saved lives, that every day the war continued was another day men died, was not merely self-serving philosophy. It was earned in the field. But the collision between them reveals something that outlasts both men. Victory in a coalition war does not belong cleanly to anyone. It is assembled from contributions that powerful men will always want to claim, order, and define on their own terms. The danger is not ambition itself. The danger is when the performance of victory begins to take priority over the substance of it. Patton crossed the Rhine in the dark, without fanfare, before the cameras were ready. That was, perhaps, the most honest thing about it. The war did not wait for the staging to be correct. It moved. And so did he. The last battlefield of great men is rarely the one they choose. It is the one history assigns them after the guns go quiet.